My name is Jorge Viñuales. I'm a professor of law and environmental policy at the University of Cambridge, as well as the director of the Center for Environment, Energy and Natural Resource Governance, Synergy, at Cambridge as well. The purpose of this lecture is to provide an overview of the international law of climate change as it stands today after the adoption in December of 2015 of the Paris Agreement on climate change. What I would like to do in this brief lecture is to address three main points. The first point is to provide some context, not only historical context on how the climate change regime has developed over the years, but also to look more broadly at other areas of international law that are particularly relevant for climate change and that influence, in fact, the way we're trying to fight climate change as a global challenge. The second point is really to focus much more on the treaties that conform the climate change regime, and by that I mean the three main treaties: the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change of 1992, the Kyoto Protocol to that convention of 1997, and the Paris Agreement, adopted first by the Conference of the Parties in 2015 and then signed and ratified in 2016, and to enter into force very soon in early November of 2016. After that presentation of the three main treaties, I will address my third point, which is in a way to look at transnational and comparative law and see how climate policy is developing at that level, because the Paris Agreement is laying the ground for this more bottom-up approach of transnational and comparative climate policy. So let me first start with the point, this context on the climate change regime. This is a particularly momentous time to be discussing climate change law because today, as I speak, in the last few months, there have been some major developments, and I would like to mention three major developments. The first is, of course, the ratification at the required levels of the Paris Agreement. So we now know that the Paris Agreement has been ratified by a sufficient number of parties, accounting for a sufficient number of emissions. So it will enter into force in early November of this year. At the same time, the meeting of the parties of a different treaty, the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer of 1987, has been amended to introduce a substance, to govern or regulate a substance that is not a substance that depletes the ozone layer, but that is in fact a global warmer, so a greenhouse gas. This is very important because it means that a different regime, a very successful regime, is being used to fight climate change as well. So we're using international law more broadly without focusing only on one treaty. And the third development that is very auspicious as well is a resolution adopted by the International Civil Aviation Organization very recently as well, that addresses the emissions from the aviation industry. This had been a very debated topic for a number of years, particularly since 2011, and had really raised some tensions between different blocs and different constituencies of the international community. So it is to be welcomed that an agreement has been found on that area as well. Now, to reach such a remarkable result, the road has been very long and very difficult. And I would like to say a word about this road before really going into the treaties that characterize the climate change regime stricto sensu. The road has to be looked at from two main perspectives. It is impossible to look at the law of climate change without looking at the science of climate change. And in fact, the science of climate change, and particularly the ascertainment of the science of climate change, began before the policy of climate change. Already in 1988, a body was set up, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, and that panel has been over the years reviewing the literature on climate change, on the science of climate change, and every 5 to 7 years it has issued an assessment report stating what is the current understanding of the climate change problem. So far we have had 5 assessment reports, one in 1990, the second one in 1995-96, the third one in 2001, the fourth one in 2007, and the fifth one, the last one, in 2013 and 14. Each time that there has been an assessment report, there has been a significant policy development on the policy pillar. So after the 1990 report, in 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted and opened for signature at the Rio Conference on Environment and Development in 1992. Then, after the 1995-96 assessment report, the negotiating mandate that was to lead to the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. That negotiating mandate was called the Berlin Mandate, and was the very first decision of the Conference of the Parties of the Climate Change Convention. That led, indeed, as I was mentioning, to the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. Then in 2001, after the third assessment report, there was a major development that echoes what is happening today as we speak in Marrakesh. The detail of the provisions of the Kyoto Protocol was developed through a number of decisions of the Conference of the Parties of the Climate Change Convention. The Kyoto Protocol was not yet in force, but the Climate Change Convention, through the adoption of a number of decisions, was already fleshing out the terms of the Kyoto Protocol. Then in 2007, after the fourth assessment report, the Conference of the Parties of the Climate Change Convention adopted a process that was supposed to lead to a sort of new protocol that was expected to be concluded in Copenhagen in 2009. Unfortunately, that process didn't reach a successful result, but the seeds that were developed through that process have influenced the content of the Paris Agreement. And in fact, in 2011, when the Conference of the Parties of the Climate Change Convention adopted the mandate, the negotiating mandate, that indeed led to the adoption of the Paris Agreement, the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, the process was organized to fit the schedule of the fifth assessment report. So the process was supposed to reach an end in 2015, and that was because the fifth assessment report was expected to be published between 2013 and 2014, and indeed it was published in these years, and it was very influential in reaching an agreement in Paris at the COP21. So that historical process is, of course, an outline of the many different sub-processes that had to be opened and closed and reopened to reach this successful end. But I guess that someone joining the conversation today would only need to know from a historical perspective that in 2011 this Durban Platform mandate was adopted and that the Durban Platform was indeed successful. Now, that context should be sufficient to understand the second part of my presentation, which is really the treaties dealing specifically with climate change. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these treaties are dealing specifically with climate change, but they are not the only treaties or the only instruments in international law that are relevant for climate change. But they are those that are more specifically addressed at this problem, and the three main treaties are interrelated. Of course, the initial treaty is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change of 1992, and I would like to say four main things about that convention, which is a sophisticated instrument. The first thing is that the convention set a goal, but the goal was not quantified. The idea of the convention was to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the troposphere at a level that does not interfere dangerously with the dynamics of the climatic system. But there was no specific quantitative goal as there is today. The second point about that convention is that it formulated three main principles, very, very important principles that have shaped the entire climate change regime since then. The first principle is a principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. That principle had been already stated in Principle 7 of the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development of 1992, and it was restated in Article 3 of the Climate Change Convention, together with two other principles. The other principle is, of course, intergenerational equity. Climate change is a problem that really creates fairness and equity issues between generations, not just within our generation. And that was acknowledged very clearly in the Climate Change Convention, as it was acknowledged, perhaps in less clear terms, in Principle 3 of the Rio Declaration of 1992. And the third principle or approach is a precautionary principle of approach. And I would like to say something about that. Perhaps at the time the Climate Change Convention was adopted in 1992, one could speak of climate change as a matter for precaution, as a matter on which there was some uncertainty. Today, climate change is no longer a matter of precaution. Today, climate change is a matter of prevention. Climate change is no longer a matter of uncertainty. Climate change is a matter of risk. And the kingdom of risk is the kingdom of the principle of prevention, whereas the kingdom of precaution is the kingdom of uncertainty. So today, despite the fact that the precautionary approach or principle is formulated, is stated in Article 3, the Convention and the subsequent instruments, the two other treaties, should be read in the light of prevention, preventing an acknowledged risk. The third component that I would like to mention of the Convention is that it provided an institutional framework, an architecture that have been extremely important to develop the subsequent instruments, not just the two subsequent treaties, but a wealth of decisions of the Conference of the Parties, setting up a variety of bodies and of mechanisms. And that institutional mechanisms, those institutional mechanisms have been possible because this framework convention envisioned its own development over time. So it is only natural that that framework convention was perhaps less precise with respect to the obligations that states were undertaking. But I would like to say a word about those obligations, because there were some obligations in the convention, and those obligations can be captured specifically by looking at Article 4 and to the annexes of the convention. So Article 4 establishes three levels of obligations. In order to understand those levels of obligations, I need to make two distinctions. The first distinction is between so-called Annex 1 countries and non-Annex 1 countries. Annex 1 countries include developed countries and countries that at the time were called countries in transition to a market economy. Whereas non-Annex I countries were developing countries, but that category of the time includes many of the main emitters of today, including China, Brazil, India, Indonesia, Mexico, and others, that are very important countries and very important economies, growing economies, so-called emerging economies. So that distinction is very important to understand what happened then with the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. So that distinction is important for Article 4 because Article 4 tried to set more specific obligations, despite the fact that these obligations were not quantified, but it tried to set more specific obligations for Annex I countries, whereas non-Annex I countries had less precise and less specific obligations. Now, that is the first distinction in terms of annexes. A second distinction that should not be conflated with the first is a distinction between Annex I countries and Annex II countries. Annex II countries are a subset of Annex I countries. In fact, Annex II countries are the richer countries within Annex I countries, and those countries have obligations of assistance, financial and technological. So those obligations of assistance are also reflected in different paragraphs of Article 4. So all in all, one can look at three categories of countries, three main categories of countries: developed countries, which have more precise obligations of emission reduction and obligations of assistance; countries in transition to a market economy that have more precise obligations of emission reduction but no obligations of assistance comparable to the first category; and the third category of countries, developing countries, that have less precise, broader, vaguer obligations under the Convention in connection with emissions reduction. Now, that distinction between Annex I and non-Annex I countries was pushed to the next level and perhaps made a little bit too rigid by the Kyoto Protocol of 1997. The Kyoto Protocol introduced for Annex I countries, that in the terms of the Kyoto Protocol are also Annex B countries, quantified emission reduction obligations, far more specific emission reduction obligations. And in fact, the approach of the Kyoto Protocol is really a top-down, a regulatory approach, whereby countries that appear in Annex B have to meet by a certain deadline a percentage of reduction of their emissions as compared with some point in the past. By way of illustration, Germany has to reduce its emissions by 8% as compared with its emissions of 1990, and it has to do so by a point in the future which is in fact called the first commitment period, between 2008 and 2012. That has been, and we can say today because there is enough information about that the Kyoto Protocol, although it covered a fraction of global emissions, something like 24% of global emissions, but the Kyoto Protocol has been successful in that respect. So the targets of different countries have been indeed respected or complied with through the machinery of the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol is a complex instrument but I don't want to go too much into the details because the most important thing for present purposes is a big picture. What is by contrast very important is to compare that top-down approach of the Kyoto Protocol with the very different approach followed by the Paris Agreement. And in order to understand the very different approach followed by the Paris Agreement, one has to recall the difference between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries. The Kyoto Protocol took that difference from the Convention and made it stronger. So some people have spoken about a wall between the two categories of countries, and a wall that was increasingly problematic because as non-Annex 1 countries, and particularly some non-Annex 1 countries, developed economically and became more powerful and more wealthy, their emissions went up and they became some of the major emitters in the world. So having an instrument that did not impose any quantified emission reduction obligations on those countries was very problematic to fight climate change as a whole. On the other hand, bringing those countries within a treaty, an emission reduction system, was very challenging from an equity perspective because those countries have not had the chance to emit and develop in the 19th century and the early 20th century. So considerations of equity clashed with considerations of effectiveness. And that sort of equation, that difficult equation, had to be solved by the Paris Agreement. And what did the Paris Agreement do to solve that equation? Well, in fact, it completely changed the approach. Instead of having a top-down approach whereby a treaty sets quantified emission reduction obligations for states, it adopted a bottom-up approach where states themselves set the level of ambition. So each state is deciding what is going to be its level of ambition. And in order to understand that, I would like to give you a bit more content on the structure, the legal structure of the Paris Agreement. Now, the Paris Agreement has three main components. The first component is the objective. As I mentioned earlier, the Convention itself did not quantify the goal of the climate change regime. Now, since 2009, a number has been used in negotiations and discussions, and that number is the 2 degrees Celsius target. So the idea is that by the end of this century, global average temperature will not have increased by more than 2 degrees Celsius as compared with pre-industrial times. In simple terms, that means that we should not go beyond 16 degrees Celsius in global average temperature. Now, that target is, of course, ambitious, but at the same time is not necessarily sufficiently ambitious, because reaching that target may entail some catastrophic consequences for a number of states, particularly low-lying islands and island states. So during the Paris negotiations, there was a lot of discussion about a more ambitious target, and that more ambitious target is the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. Now, those two targets in a way collided because the 1.5 degrees Celsius target is extremely ambitious, but at the same time, in equitable terms, better for the main victim countries of climate change. Whereas the 2 degrees Celsius is perhaps more realistic, but it may have catastrophic consequences for some countries. That tension was settled by the language of the Paris Agreement in Article 2 that speaks of well below 2 degrees Celsius. So what we are targeting today is something between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius increase of global average temperature by the end of this century. That figure was not in the convention, and for the first time that figure appears in a treaty on climate change. So first component, the goal of the Paris Agreement. Of course, there are other goals of the Paris Agreement, and there is another goal that has been mentioned this time in Article 4.1, which is a sort of general equilibrium between emissions and removals. So it's balance between the emissions and the removals of carbon dioxide from the troposphere. That would be called perhaps carbon neutrality by the second half of this century. This is a goal that is vaguer, perhaps in terms, in legal terms, because it may be reached through a variety of means, and it is unclear to what extent that will entail emission reductions or to what extent it will entail removals. But what has to be kept in mind for present purposes is that the goal of the Paris Agreement is far more specific than the goal of the previous instruments. So first component of the Paris Agreement, the goals. Second component of the Paris Agreement, the three main action areas of the Paris Agreement. And those areas are mitigation, adaptation, and an addition to the Paris, to the climate change negotiations, which is called loss and damage. Now, the distinction between the three levels is very simple to explain and very difficult in practice. The distinction between mitigation and adaptation is fairly simple. Mitigation means to reduce the emissions that are causing climate change. Adaptation means to adapt to the consequences of climate change, for countries and communities to adapt for the consequences of climate change. And loss and damage means to account for in some way for the consequences that have already been felt, that is too late to adapt to. Now, those three action areas are addressed in the Paris Agreement in a different set of articles. The most specific articles are those dealing with mitigation, Articles 3 to 6 of the Paris Agreement. Adaptation has its own article, Article 7, as does loss and damage, Article 8. But Article 8 is a little bit confined, is less interwoven with the rest of the treaty, whereas mitigation and adaptation is fully spelled out and in interaction with the rest of the treaty provisions. I would like to say a word on mitigation because it is important to understand the bottom-up approach that I was mentioning earlier. The mitigation approach followed by the Paris Agreement is no longer a top-down regulatory approach whereby states have quantified emission reduction obligations stated in a rigid annex that is difficult to modify. The approach followed by the Paris Agreement is that each state will declare through a unilateral act, through a discretionary act, its own level of ambition in what is called a nationally determined contribution. Now, nationally determined contributions are really at the discretion of states, but with some limitations. What are those limitations? Well, first, at least every 5 years, states have to adjust their nationally determined contribution. And second limitation, that each time that the nationally determined contribution is adjusted, it has to become more ambitious. That is called the progression principle, and that principle is a major innovation of the Paris Agreement. Now, in addition to that, there is this idea that nationally determined contributions should have to be stated in harmonized or at least equivalent terms. It is very important that countries are saying something which is comparable, because without that ability to compare what countries are trying to achieve, it will be very difficult to see whether the Paris Agreement is setting the world on a path towards solving the problem of climate change, or at least addressing successfully the problem of climate change. But the approach is very different, particularly in connection with differentiation. We're no longer saying there are 2 or 3 groups of states. We're saying each state will set its own level of ambition and set its own strategies. So differentiation is the very essence of the Paris Agreement. So I mentioned the goals of the Paris Agreement. I mentioned the 3 main action areas. I would like to move now to the third component of the Paris Agreement, which is its architecture for implementation. And that architecture for implementation is quite sophisticated as well, and it has 3 main components. The first main component is a system of transparency. That system of transparency, or that I would like to call a sort of informational system, a system based on gathering and making information transparent, is organized particularly in Articles 13 and 14. Article 13 sets up a process through which the performance of states will be reviewed in a technical and non-adversarial manner, but that performance will be reviewed, so will be more transparent over time, and states will to some extent have to stand by what they have done during a given period with respect to their own nationally determined contribution, so with respect to their own strategy, their own goal. It's quite interesting. I have seen that process in some other areas. Interestingly, one area where that process is at play is nuclear safety. So it is not an area, I mean, some observers have been quite pessimistic about that process of compliance. I am not that pessimistic. I believe that it is a very interesting process, and non-adversarial processes may be the best solution in the context of climate change. But that's a very key mechanism that has been introduced by Article 13. Another very key mechanism that has been introduced this time by Article 14 is what is called the global stocktake. Now, the global stocktake is making a difference between what are the trees and what is the forest. The global stocktake is not about what each country did over a given period of time. It's not about compliance, or it's not about looking at the performance of a given country, but it's really looking about the performance of the entire set of efforts on climate change, the entire forest. The point of that global stocktake is to see, are we getting closer to our goals? Are we moving in the right direction, instead of trying to say whether a country is performing properly or successfully its own nationally determined contributions? So that global stocktake is something that was not clearly into either the Convention or the Kyoto Protocol. It is the big picture. It is really a focus on effectiveness, again in a non-adversarial way. Of course, nationally determined contributions, the results of the transparency mechanism, all that is going to feed into this global stocktake that is to take place also regularly. The first, I believe, is scheduled for the early 2020s, 2023, I believe. So the process is particularly interesting, because if a global stocktake is telling states we are not moving in the right direction, then states would be expected to become more and more ambitious in their nationally determined contributions. It is an information loop. It is really moving from the trees to the forest, from the forest to the trees, and so on. So it's a very interesting process. So that's the first component of the implementation platform of the Paris Agreement, the informational component. The second component, which is more traditional, is facilitation of compliance. And facilitation of compliance comes in two varieties. The first is, of course, assistance. And assistance has different phases: financial assistance, technological assistance, and capacity building. But also facilitation comes in another variant, which is more efficiency. And efficiency has been integrated into the Paris Agreement by means of a number of market mechanisms. Now, market mechanisms are something that were already well known in the Kyoto Protocol, and even already to some extent in earlier attempts such as the Montreal Protocol. But these market mechanisms are particularly interesting because the Paris Agreement is providing for the first time an anchor, a legal anchor, to reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, the so-called RED approach. And Article 5 is providing an anchor to this potentially very cost-effective or cost-efficient ways of limiting emissions at the lowest cost. The other market mechanism, which is the other two market mechanisms that are particularly interesting, are the Sustainable Development Mechanism, which is a project-based mechanism, very similar to what was already in the Kyoto Protocol, the so-called joint implementation and clean development mechanisms, but potentially with a wider scope. The detail, of course, is going to be developed over time, and a lot of work has been done over this year already. And the third market mechanism that I would like to mention is a so-called, this is new, is a so-called linking of domestic or subnational or regional systems of emission reductions. And this mechanism of linking is stated in a very embryonic form in the Paris Agreement in Article 6, but it provides a basis for one jurisdiction to recognize the emission credits or the emission allowances issued by another jurisdiction, thus linking two caps in the absence of a global cap as in the Kyoto Protocol. So there is no global cap in the Paris Agreement on emissions as there was in the Kyoto Protocol, but there is something that could become a global cap through the linking of different national, subnational, or regional systems. And as I will discuss later, there are a number of systems, quite a few, and in very important countries and regions. So the last component of the implementation platform of the Paris Agreement, after informational requirements and facilitation, is of course compliance. And the Paris Agreement in that respect is not very innovative. It simply states, creates a basis for a non-compliance procedure, perhaps a non-compliance procedure which is less confrontational than the non-compliance procedure of the Kyoto Protocol, because it will not have an enforcement branch. That was very important for gathering consensus among different states. And it has a provision that refers to the provisions of the Convention on Dispute Settlement in case of interstate disputes. So all in all, the Paris Agreement has a very sophisticated architecture with these three main components: goals, with a variety of goals, action areas with 3 action areas, not just mitigation, and a variety of implementation mechanisms with informational mechanisms, facilitation of compliance, and facilitation of the action of state, and compliance mechanisms. Now, how will this mechanism work in practice? Well, that leads me to the third and final point that I would like to address in this short lecture, which is, well, the Paris Agreement is adopting a bottom-up approach, not a top-down. So the Paris Agreement is coordinating, trying to provide some overall coordination to what states are going to do in their own jurisdictions, and not only states, but non-state actors as well. The decision of the Conference of the Parties that accompany the Paris Agreement had a specific section on non-party stakeholders, cities, regions, the private sector, and so on. And those non-party stakeholders are very, very active in connection with climate policy. So before I conclude, I would like to say a word about some transnational and some developments in transnational law and in comparative law. And I would like to address that from three main perspectives. One perspective is, of course, the development over the last years of carbon pricing instruments. Now, the World Bank every year issues a report on the state of carbon markets, which is a very important report because it really gives a snapshot of what is the stage of development of carbon markets. And over the years, those reports have shown that carbon pricing instruments, and by that I mean taxes on carbon emissions or cap and trade systems, so a cap on overall emissions and the ability to trade allowances among the participants in the system, those type of systems have become more and more palatable at the domestic level. And there are right now something like 40 such systems in different countries and jurisdictions, and sometimes in subnational, at the subnational level, such as federated states or regions. And of note, I would like to mention three main areas. Of course, the emissions trading scheme in the European Union has been a pioneer in the area, but right now there are emission trading schemes in the United States, not at the state level, but at the level of California and the Northeast states, and also in China. China is moving from a pilot system where there were cities and regions experimenting with a cap and trade system to a national system. This is a very, very important development, and it shows that major constituencies at the global level are taking climate change very, very seriously. So it's very important. What is the main challenge that we're facing today in connection with carbon pricing systems? Well, the main challenge is that most of those systems are setting a price of carbon that is yet too low. In order for a price on carbon to really generate a different action, different behavior from economic actors, a ton of carbon dioxide should cost something like $30 per ton of carbon dioxide emitted in the troposphere. Today, most of the carbon dioxide covered by these cap and trade systems, probably more than 80% of the carbon dioxide covered by these cap and trade systems, is trading at a price of less than $10 per ton. So there is some room for improvement, of course, but the fact that these carbon pricing systems are there is particularly important and should not be underestimated. So this is one area where climate action is already being taken very clearly at the level of states and subnational entities, and sometimes regional groups of states. Another way of looking at the same phenomenon, but capturing a broader set of instruments, is if one looks at the report that is adopted every year for the last 4 or 5 years by an NGO of parliamentarians called GLOBE, and with support of academic institutions in the United Kingdom, as well as of the Climate Change Secretariat. And this report, which is very, very useful, is the report on climate legislation. And that report is covering really what is the legislative and regulatory action that is being taken in a wide set of countries, accounting for more than 90% of emissions. And what that report is showing, and has been showing over the years, is that most of the countries of this set of countries that account for more than 90% of global emissions have some form of climate legislation or climate regulation already in place. So the legal authority is already in place. In many cases, it has not been used yet in ways that really require mitigation, but the legal authority is there. So one can only expect that that legal authority is, of course, going to be used. And that should give a clear signal to the economy, to economic actors, that climate change legislation and climate change action is real and is imminent. It's going to take place, it's going to happen, and I hope that in the years to come, when one looks at this lecture, that forecast is not just a wish, but a reality. The third approach that I would like to give to this action that has been taken at the subnational level is a very useful platform that was launched in 2014 at the Conference of the Parties that took place in Lima, Peru. And in at that occasion, a platform called NAZCA, N-A-Z-C-A, was launched to really compile all the different actions that were taken in connection with climate change mitigation, particularly at the level of cities, regions, private sector, and so on. And when one looks at that platform, there is so much that is going on that one can only be encouraged by the level of commitment that many of these non-party stakeholders are showing about climate change. So I believe that there is really a lot of room for optimism in connection with climate change after the Paris Agreement. And in concluding these remarks, I would like to express the hope of my generation that the Paris Agreement will influence our development path towards a carbon neutral socioeconomic system, so that future generations that may be looking at or watching this audiovisual library lecture one day will look back to the Paris Agreement and really see it as a critical legal and political juncture that changed the way in which our fossil fuel society decided to reorganize itself. Thank you very much.